The refectory of Anchorage Kelverath was the largest single room in the Fourth Imperial Quadrant, and it had been built that way on purpose, so that every cadet who walked into it would understand, in the first 3 seconds, exactly how small they were. It could seat 11,000. Its ceiling was a vault of black alloy ribbed like the inside of some enormous chest, and set into that vault were 440 light wells that changed color with the shift bells: amber for first meal, white for second, a deep and drowsy blue for third. Its floor was a single poured slab of gray composite, polished by 90 generations of boots. Down its center ran the long tables, 60 of them, each one 200 meters of unbroken bench, and at those tables sat the sons and daughters and hatchlings and sporkin of 61 member species of the Concordant Empire, eating the same gray protein loaf out of the same gray trays, and learning, meal by meal, where they belonged in the order of things. That was the true curriculum, not astrogation, not fleet law, not the ballistics of a plasma lance. The refectory taught seating, who sat near the head of a table and who sat at the foot, who moved aside and who did not, which species nodded to which, and in what degree of angle, and how long a Voran was permitted to hold the eye of a Thesic before it became a challenge. The Empire had ruled 11,000 worlds for 4,000 years, and it had not done so with guns. It had done it with seating. Teodor Marsh had been at Kelverath for 9 months, and he still got it wrong. He was 19. He was the first human ever admitted to the fleet line intake, which everyone from the human consulate down to his own mother had reminded him of roughly once a day since the letter came. He was of medium height by human standards, which made him small in most rooms here, and he had the kind of face that gave everything away, a bad face for an empire. His hands were always faintly stained from the reactor shop, and he had a habit, which 3 separate instructors had noted in 3 separate evaluations, of asking questions after the answer had already been given. That was the thing about him. That was the whole thing about him, though nobody, including Teo, had yet noticed it. He did not know when a subject was closed. He noticed her on the first day of the 9th month, in the white light of second meal, and afterward he was never able to explain why that day, and not one of the 20 before it. She sat at the far end of table 41, near the eastern wall, under a light well that had been dead so long that nobody had bothered to log it. She sat with her back straight and her hands flat on the table on either side of a tray, and she did not eat. She was Sorrai. He knew that much. The Sorrai were tall and narrow, gray-skinned in the way that river stones are gray, with dark eyes set wide and a fine ridge of bone that ran from the bridge of the nose up over the crown of the skull like the keel of an overturned boat. They were navigators mostly, voyage readers. The Empire had used them to find its way for 2,000 years, and they were respected the way a good instrument is respected, which is to say completely, and without warmth. She was young. That was the part that snagged him, not an officer, not an elder. Young, his age or near it, in a cadet's undertunic with the shoulder flashes torn off, which he had never seen before on anyone. And around her, for a radius of perhaps 6 meters in every direction, table 41 was empty. Not empty the way a table is empty when a room is not full. The room was full. The room was overfull that day, because the Gelt intake had arrived and there were 400 extra bodies looking for bench, and cadets were sitting on the floor along the eastern wall with their trays on their knees, rather than take one of the 80 free places within 6 meters of the Sorrai girl. T stood in the aisle with his tray in his hands and looked at that hole in the room, and something in him went very quiet and very cold, the way it does when you see a thing that has been in front of you for a long time. He turned to the cadet beside him, a Gelt named Ossic whom he half knew from the pressure lab, a squat amphibious creature with a voice like water going down a drain. Why is nobody sitting there? Ossic did not look. That was the first strange thing. Ossic did not even look, and Ossic was the sort who looked at everything, who had once spent an entire lab period staring at a leaking valve with an expression of religious joy. "Sitting where?" Ossick said. 41, the end of it. There's 80 seats." "There is nothing at the end of 41, said Ossick, and moved off down the aisle with his tray and did not look back. Teo stood there for a while. The tide of the refectory broke around him. 11,000 beings finding their places by an algorithm none of them had ever been taught and all of them knew, and he stood in the middle of it holding a tray of gray loaf and watching a girl not eat. He sat in the end where he always sat at table 12 with the technical intake, and he ate his loaf, and every 90 seconds or so he looked up. She never moved. She sat with her hands flat and her back straight and her eyes on nothing, and when the shift bell rang, she stood and lifted her tray and carried it untouched to the reclamation slot and put it in. Then she walked out, and here was the thing. Here was the thing he could not stop thinking about that night, lying in his bunk while his roommate rumbled through the wall of sleep. As she walked the length of the refectory, 300 meters, through 11,000 people, a channel opened in front of her. Not violently, nobody shoved, nobody stared, it was smoother than that and worse. Bodies simply drifted. Conversations found something urgent to attend to on the far side. A Vorin turned a shoulder. A cluster of Thessic cadets bent their heads over a slate at precisely the moment she passed. It was like watching iron filings arrange themselves around the wrong pole of a magnet, and it was so practiced, so beautifully coordinated, so utterly without effort, that Teo understood he was not watching cruelty at all. He was watching a procedure. He asked his roommate about it the next morning. His roommate was a Vorin named Hakon Rogue, and Hakon Rogue was 300 kilos of banded muscle and old honor, with a jaw like the front of a cargo hauler, and a voice you felt in your sternum before you heard it. He was first in the fleet line intake. He had been first in every intake he had ever been in, and he had at some point in the last 9 months decided, for reasons Teo had never fully understood, that the small hairless creature in the bunk below him was his responsibility. Hakon woke him when he overslept. Hakon ate his loaf when Teo could not face it. Hakon had once broken up a corridor scuffle by putting one hand flat on the wall beside Teo's head, which had ended the scuffle instantly and left a dent that was still there. "There's a Sorrai," Teo said, pulling on his boots. "Table 41, nobody sits with her." Hakon stopped moving. This was, Teo would come to understand, a very significant thing. Vorin did not stop moving. Vorin believed that a body at rest was a body in shame. Hakon stood in the middle of the cabin with a boot in his hand, and went as still as furniture. "She is residual," he said. "She's what?" "Do not," said Hakon, "say the word again in this room." Teo sat back on the bunk. "Hakon, what's a residual?" The Vorin turned. His eyes were small and orange and set deep, and they were, at that moment, doing something Teo had never seen in them, which was avoiding him. "There is nothing at the end of 41, Hakon said. "That is the correct answer. When you are asked, that is the answer you will give. It is not a lie, Marsh. It is a courtesy. It costs you nothing, and it costs the Empire nothing, and it costs her nothing, because she has already spent everything she has." "What did she do?" "Nothing." "Then—" "She did nothing," said Hakon Rogue, and he said it with a weight that shut the room. "That is precisely the point. She did nothing, and 11 others died, and she came back, and now she is residual, and there is nothing at the end of 41. Put on your boots. You will be late, and they are watching you, human, because you are the first, and if you are late, they will not write Marsh was late. They will write the humans were late. Do you understand?" Teo understood. He had understood since the day he arrived. He carried the understanding around like a stone in his coat. He put on his boots. He went to class. He did not stop thinking about it. He started counting the next day, and once he started counting, he could not stop, because the number turned out to be terrible. Day 1, by his count, was the 22nd day of the 9th month, but she had been there before he started counting. He went and pulled the refectory access logs, which any cadet could do, because the Empire believed that transparency in small matters made opacity in large ones easier to accept, and he ran a query on table 41, seat 906, and the number came back and sat in front of him on the slate, glowing. 22 days. 22 days of 3 meals. 66 times, she had walked into the largest room in the quadrant and taken a tray, and sat down at the end of table 41 under the dead light, and sat there for exactly the mandated 40 minutes, and put the tray in the slot, untouched or nearly, and walked out through the channel that opened in front of her like water in front of a stone. 66 times. 11,000 people, 3 times a day, for 22 days, and not one of them had sat down. Teo went and looked at the number for a long time, and then he did a thing he would later think of as the actual beginning, the real one, before the tray and the chair and everything that came after. He tried to imagine it. Not to think about it, which is easy, but to imagine it. To put himself in the seat. 40 minutes. The noise of 11,000 voices, which is not noise at all when you are inside it, but a kind of warm sea, a sound like belonging. And to sit in the middle of that sea in a bubble of silence 6 meters wide, 3 times a day, and look at a wall. 66 times. He was 19 years old, and he had never in his life gone a full day without someone saying his name. He went to the kitchens that evening, because he had learned in 9 months that the kitchens of any institution know more than its administration, and he found Baloo. Baloo was a mott, which meant she was old, because motts were only ever old. They came out of the vats at what other species would call late middle age, and they aged from there for 200 years, and this had given the species a certain attitude toward hurry. Baloo ran the third shift line. She had 4 arms and a face like a folded blanket, and she had been feeding cadets at Kelverath since before Teo's grandparents were born. "You want to ask me about the Sorrai," she said, before he opened his mouth. "How did you?" "Because you have been looking at her for 3 days, and you have a face like a window, boy. Sit. No, there on the crate. Do not touch that, it is hot." He sat on the crate. "Her name," Baloo said, "is Ashaven Dorosal. She was junior astrogator on a survey cutter, the Long Patience. 11 crew. 2 years ago the drive went into Cascade in deep transit, and the ship came apart. She was in the observation blister taking a star fix, which is the only compartment on a cutter with independent pressure and its own beacon. They found her 19 days later. She was the only one." "So she's a survivor," Teo said. "Why does that?" "Among the Sorrai," said Baloo, and she said it slowly, the way you set down something breakable, "the sole survivor of a lost crew is HFY. It means, more or less, one who owes the dying. It is not a punishment. Understand me, boy, it is not a punishment, whatever it looks like from where you sit. It is a debt, and it is a right, and the right is that she must be witnessed. Someone must come to her of their own will, unasked, and sit with her and eat with her and speak the names of her dead aloud with her. When that is done, the debt is closed. She is HFY, restored. She may take her name and her rank and her place back, and no Sorrai will ever speak of it again." Teo stared at her. "That's it. Someone just has to sit with her." "That is it." "Then why hasn't?" "Because," said Baloo, "no one is permitted to." She turned back to her vats and stirred something, and her 4 arms moved in a rhythm that had not changed in 140 years, and she talked while she stirred, and Teo listened with a slowly rising sensation in his chest that he could not name and would not be able to name for weeks. 400 years ago the Empire absorbed the Sorrai worlds. The Empire does not destroy customs, boy. It is much cleverer than that. It respects them. It sent ethnographers, and they wrote everything down, and everything they wrote down went into the register of accommodated practice, and every practice in that register became imperial statute, enforceable by the prefecture, on every station and world and ship of the Concordant Empire. so that no member species would ever have to feel that its ways were disregarded. She stirred. The Sorrai practice of HFY was written down in the third survey, and so it became law. And the law says, no being of the empire shall consort with, dine with, address, or offer comfort to one under the right of HFY, save by the will of the Sorrai assembly. Penalty for a first offense, 30 demerits and a formal reprimand. Second offense, review. Third, expulsion. It is a small law. It is one line in a register with 400,000 lines in it, and it has been enforced perhaps 11 times in 4 centuries, and it has never once been questioned because it is a courtesy. It costs nothing. But the right needs someone to sit with her, Teo said. The right needs it, and the law says nobody can, that's. Yes, said Baloo. That's insane. It cancels itself out. Yes. Then somebody just has to tell them. Somebody just has to walk into the prefecture and say, look, you've written it down wrong. The whole thing is backwards. Baloo stopped stirring. She turned around and she looked at him with 400 years of institutional knowledge in her folded blanket face, and she said, gently, the way you tell a child something true. She has 19 times. There is a form. The Vats hissed. There is a form, Baloo said again, and it goes to the Office of Accommodated Practice, and the Office of Accommodated Practice reviews a registered custom only upon receipt of a determination of factual obsolescence, and a determination of factual obsolescence is issued only by an arbiter, and an arbiter may only issue one in the course of adjudicating a live matter. And there is no live matter. She wiped 2 of her hands on her apron. There has never been a live matter, because in 400 years nobody has broken the law. Teo sat on the hot crate in the steam and the smell of protein loaf, 19 years old, first human in the fleet line, and he heard the whole shape of it come together in his head with a sound like a lock closing. And she can't ask anyone to, he said slowly, can she? Baloo's eyes came up. Something moved behind them. No, she said, a witnessing that is asked for is void, and a violation that is solicited is not a violation, it is entrapment and it is inadmissible. If she asks, she gets nothing, and whoever she asked gets punished for nothing. The old Mott turned back to her vats, so she does not ask. She sits and she waits and she says nothing to anyone, and she has been doing it for 22 days and she has 18 left, because the right has a window, 40 days from the day of return to service, and when it closes she is unnamed. Not residual. Unnamed. Stripped, discharged, sent home to live silent in a house at the edge of a town, and no Sorrai will ever say her name again, including her own kin, including her mother, for as long as she lives. She stirred. 18 days, she said. And I put an extra portion on her tray every night, and I have done it for 22 nights, and boy, it is worth nothing. It is worth less than nothing. It lets me sleep. That is all it buys. It has never once been worth anything to her. Teodor Marsh walked back to his bunk through the long gray corridors of Anchorage Kelverath, and he did not sleep, and above him in the dark Hakon Rogue breathed like a slow engine, and at some point in the third watch he stopped trying. The next day was day 23. He went to second meal. He took a tray. He stood in the aisle in the white light with 11,000 people finding their places around him, and he looked down the length of the room to the dead light well at the eastern wall, and the hole in the world beneath it, and the straight-backed shape sitting in the middle of the hole with her hands flat on the table. He thought about the fleet line. He thought about the letter. He thought about his mother and the consulate and the phrase they will not write, Marsh was late. They will write, the humans were late. And he understood with a clarity that made his ears ring exactly what this was going to cost and exactly how little of it he would get back. Then he walked. 300 meters is not far. A person walks it in 4 minutes, unhurried, carrying a tray. The refectory did not notice him for the first 100. He was one body among 11,000, moving down the aisle between table 20 and table 22, and the great warm sea of voices went on around him. He passed the Gelt, who ate in a wet and companionable riot. He passed the Thesic, who ate in silence with their slates propped against their water pitchers. He passed a table of second-year engineers arguing about a coupling failure, and one of them raised a hand to him and said, "Marsh," and he said, "Yeah," and kept walking. At about 150 meters, the sound began to change. It did not stop. That was the strange thing, the thing he tried to describe to himself afterward and never quite managed. Nobody gasped. Nobody pointed. But there was a species of attention that moved through the room the way a change in pressure moves through a hull, felt before it is heard, and by 200 meters he could feel it on the back of his neck like a hand. At 250 meters he passed table 38, and a Vorin he did not know stood up. The Vorin did not speak. He simply stood and turned and put his broad back to the aisle, and after a moment the 4 Vorin beside him stood and did the same, and then the whole of the table's near end was a wall of backs, and Teo understood that this was not aggression. It was the opposite of aggression. It was the last mercy they knew how to offer. They were unseeing him. They were giving him the chance to not have happened. He kept walking. At 280 meters the noise of the refectory did stop, in a ring, spreading outward from him like ice forming on a pond. And by the time his boots crossed into the 6-meter emptiness at the end of table 41, 11,000 beings had gone silent, and he could hear the ventilation, which he had never in 9 months heard, a soft, endless breath from the ribs of the vault. HFY Dorosal did not look up. She had her hands flat on the table on either side of her tray, and her back was straight, and her eyes were on the wall, and she had been sitting in that exact posture for 22 days, and she did not look up, because in 22 days she had learned that the sound of a person approaching was always the sound of a person passing. Teo set his tray down across from her. The clack of it was very loud. He pulled out the bench, which took effort, because the benches at Kelverath were fixed at one end and swung on a pivot, and the pivot shrieked. He sat down. He picked up his loaf and he took a bite, and he chewed it, and it was exactly as bad as it always was, and he was distantly amazed to discover that his hands were not shaking. Then he swallowed and he said, "My name's Teodor Marsh." She looked at him. He had not seen her face straight on before. It was thin and it was gray, and the ridge of bone rose over her skull like the keel of a boat, and her eyes were enormous and black and dry, and they were not grateful. They were not soft. They were the eyes of an animal that has been in a trap for 3 weeks, and has learned that the sound of footsteps means the trap is about to be tightened. "Get up," she said. Her standard was perfect, better than his. "No," said Teo. "Get up and walk away, and I will tell them you were lost." Her voice was low, urgent, almost nothing, a thing pushed out through a very small opening. "You are new here. You are the human. They will believe you were lost. Get up." "I know your name," said Teo. "It's HFY Dorosal. You were the junior astrogator on the long patience." He watched the words go into her, and he watched what they did, and it was the single most frightening thing he had ever seen in his life, because for 1/2 of 1 second the whole architecture of her face came apart, and then it went back together, and she was stone again, and only the black eyes were wet. "Do not say the ship," she said. "Sorry." "Do not say the ship." Her hands had come off the table. They were fists. "Do you know what you have done? Do you have the smallest idea what you have?" She stopped. She closed her eyes. She breathed. When she opened them she was in command of herself, and she spoke very quietly and very quickly, the way a person speaks when they are trying to get a warning out before an explosion. "Listen to me. There is a statute, Register of Accommodated Practice, entry 11,004. You are in violation of it. There is a prefect standing at the north door, and he has been watching you since you crossed table 30. When you stand up, he will take your name and you will receive 30 demerits and a formal reprimand, And if you are on the fleet line and you are, everyone knows you are, that reprimand ends it, today. Not in a hearing, today. The line is a merit line. It has no room for a reprimand. Do you understand what I am telling you? Yeah, said Teo. Then get up. No, said Teo, and took another bite of loaf. She stared at him. And then she did something that he had absolutely not prepared for, and that he thought about for the rest of his life. She put her face in her hands. Her shoulders went. And she made a sound, one sound, a thin, cracked thing torn straight up out of the floor of her, and it was not weeping, or not only weeping. It was closer to the noise a person makes when a wound that has gone numb comes suddenly and horribly back to life. 11,000 beings watched. Nobody moved. 22 days, she said into her hands. 22 days, and it is a child. I'm 19. It is a child, she said, who does not know what he is spending. I went to the kitchens, said Teo. I talked to Baloo. I know what the 40 days are, and I know what unnamed means, and I know what the reprimand costs me. I've had a day and a night to think about it. I'm not lost, and I'm not confused, and I'm not brave. I'm actually pretty scared, if you want to know. I've been sweating through this shirt since the north door. He looked down at his tray. You've got an extra portion. Baloo does that. Ashaven took her hands away from her face. Yes, she said, she does. Are you going to eat it? Something happened in her face. It took him a moment to identify it, because he had never seen it on a Sorrai, and because it was so small, and because it was buried under 22 days of rock. You are asking, she said, whether I am going to eat my dinner. Well, yeah. She looked at the tray, she looked at him. She picked up the loaf, and she looked at it for a long moment as if it were an artifact recovered from a dig, and then she put it in her mouth and bit down and chewed and swallowed, and the swallow was hard and it hurt her, and she did it again. She had been eating perhaps 400 calories a day for 3 weeks, because she found she could not swallow with the room watching, and she was so hungry that eating had become frightening. They ate, neither of them said anything else. The refectory, having decided that whatever this was, it was not going to be quick, gradually and unwillingly returned to noise, though it was a different noise now, a thin and glassy version of itself, and every being in the room was doing 2 things at once, and one of those things was watching table 41. At the shift bell, they stood together. Prefect Sarn Alo was waiting at the reclamation slot with a slate. He was a gelt of middle years, damp and immaculate, and he was not cruel. That was the thing Teo would come to understand about all of them, eventually, and it was the worst thing. Sarn Alo did not enjoy this. He wished, on the whole, that it were not happening. He had a family and a good record, and he was 2 years from a posting on a garden world, and he took no pleasure whatsoever in what he was about to do. Cadet, he said, name and number. Teodor Marsh, 9941. Sarn Alo entered it. His stylus made a small, dry ticking sound. You are cited under Accommodation Statute 11004, consorting with one under Registered Right. 30 demerits entered. A formal reprimand will follow to your line supervisor within 1 shift. He hesitated, and then he did a thing that was, in its way, an enormous kindness and cost him a great deal and helped nobody at all. He lowered his voice. Cadet Marsh, you are new. If you file a statement of cultural ignorance within the hour, the citation is reduced to an advisory. It will not touch your line, do you understand me, within the hour. No thanks, said Teo. The prefect's damp eyes moved once to the Sorrai standing 2 paces away with her tray in her hands, and away again, very fast, the way a hand moves off a hot plate. Then be advised, he said, that a 2nd citation triggers review and a 3rd triggers expulsion proceedings, and that the citations are per meal. He straightened. Good shift, cadet. Teo put his tray in the slot. Ashaven put hers in the slot. They walked out through the channel that opened in front of them together, and now the channel opened for 2, and it was somehow much worse to be inside it than to watch it from outside, because from inside you could see their faces, and their faces were not hateful. They were embarrassed. They were sorry. They were the faces of decent people who wished very much that you would stop. In the corridor, she rounded on him. "Parmeal," she said. "You heard him, Parmeal." "I heard him. Third meal is in 6 hours. If you come to third meal, you will be cited a second time and you will go to review. And review for a human, for the first human, for the only human will not be a review, it will be a demonstration." She was shaking. Her long gray hands were shaking and she folded them into her sleeves to stop it. "You have made your gesture. It is seen. The room saw it and I saw it, and it is the only kind thing that has happened to me in 2 years, and I am telling you now, while you can still take it back, that it is enough. Do you hear me, human? It is enough. Go and eat with your own people." Teodor Marsh looked at her in the gray corridor light. "See you at third," he said. He turned and walked away, and behind him HFY Dorosal stood absolutely still with her hands in her sleeves, and did not move for a long time. She had spent 22 days with a very simple problem, and one impossible variable. She was not a passive creature. She had never been a passive creature, whatever the Empire's file on her said, and whatever her own mind said to her in the third watch when she could not sleep. In the 2 years since they cut her out of the observation blister, she had done nothing but work. She had learned Imperial statute from the ground up, because nobody would teach her, from public registers and cadet primers and the prefecture's own published commentaries. She had found the flaw in 6 days. It was not even a subtle flaw. It was enormous. It was obscene. It was sitting in plain sight in the middle of the register like a body in a hallway that everyone had agreed to step over. The register froze customs. It did not track them. The Sorrai Assembly had reformed HFY 189 years ago. The right of witnessing had been reduced to a formality within a year of a lost crew's return, then to a ceremony, then to a memory, and on the Sorrai homeworlds, a sole survivor now came home to her family and was fed and held and wept over, and the debt of the dying was considered closed by the simple fact of grief. Her own mother had never sat a HFY in her life. Her own mother did not know the shape of it. On Sorrai soil, HFY Dorosal would have walked off the ship into her mother's arms. But the long patience had been an Imperial hull, and she had been recovered by an Imperial cutter, and she had been returned to Imperial service, and on Imperial ground the custom that governed her was not the one her people actually practiced. It was the one an ethnographer had written down 400 years ago and filed. Entry 11,004. A dead custom, embalmed by an empire that had been trying to be polite, and enforced with perfect fidelity on 11,000 worlds by a prefecture that had never once asked whether the thing in the file still existed anywhere but the file. She had the proof. That was the thing that made her want to put her head through a bulkhead. She had all of it. She had the Assembly's reform records. She had 189 years of comparative practice. She had the ethnographer's own field notes, which admitted in a marginal annotation that the practice was already in decline among the coastal houses. She had assembled, alone at the end of table 41, in a bubble of silence 6 meters wide, 3 times a day, 40 minutes at a time, on a cadet slate, the most complete determination of factual obsolescence ever prepared for the office of accommodated practice. And it was worth nothing, because the office would not read it. The office reviewed a registered custom only upon receipt of an arbiter's finding, and an arbiter could only make a finding in the course of adjudicating a live matter, and a live matter required a prosecution, and a prosecution required a violation, and a violation required a person. One person, willing, unsolicited, and ruined. She had sat at the end of table 41 for 22 days, in front of 11,000 of the finest young minds of the Concordant Empire, holding the key to the door in her hand, and she had not been able to ask a single one of them to walk through it, because the asking would void it, because a solicited violation is entrapment, because a witnessing that is requested is not a witnessing. So she had done the only thing left. She had sat where she could be seen. She had left the chair across from her empty. She had made herself into a question 3 times a day for 22 days, and 11,000 people had walked past the question, and she had watched their faces as they did, and she had learned something about the empire that she thought perhaps no one else alive knew. They were not evil, not one of them. She had looked at 66 meals of faces, and she had not found evil in a single one. What she had found was worse, and it was this: every one of them was waiting for someone else to do it. Every one of them thought it was a shame. Every one of them looked away and felt the small hot nick of shame and forgot it by the corridor. And the reason none of them had sat down was not that they hated her. It was that it would have been awkward. That was it. That was the whole thing. 400 years of statute and 11,000 worlds and the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever produced, and the load-bearing beam of the entire structure. The one thing holding the whole terrible architecture up was that nobody wanted to be the one who made a scene. And then on the 23rd day, in the white light of second meal, a 19-year-old human being had walked 300 meters through a silent room carrying a tray of protein loaf, and had sat down in the chair, and had said his name, and had refused to leave, and had been fined 30 demerits and had said no thanks. Ashevin Dorosal stood in the corridor with her hands in her sleeves for a very long time. She had 18 days. She had her live matter. And she was going to have to use him, and she knew exactly what it was going to cost him, and she had not asked, and she would never ask, and she was already, in the cold, clear part of her mind that had been a navigator's before it was anything else, beginning to plot the course. She hated herself for it, and she went to third meal anyway. He was already there. He had gotten there early, and he had gotten 2 trays, and he had put one of them on her side of the table, and when she came through the channel of turned backs and stopped at the end of table 41, he looked up and said, "They're out of the green stuff. I got you extra loaf." The prefect cited him at the bell. It was the second. The human consulate on Kelverath occupied 4 rooms on the 18th ring, and 3 of them were storage. Consul Miriam Ade received him in the 4th. She was 51, and she had spent 26 years of her life on the diplomacy of a species nobody had heard of, and she had personally negotiated humanity's fleet line seat over 11 years and 4 failed attempts, and she had a photograph of Teodor Marsh on her desk, in a frame, because when the letter came she had wept in a stairwell for 10 minutes and then gone back to work. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Do you know what you are?" she said. "Consul." "You are the answer to a question," she said. "The question is, are humans capable of holding a position of responsibility in the Concordant Empire, or are they a novelty species that should be given shipping contracts and left alone? That question has been open for 31 years. It is answered by you. Not by me, not by the Assembly, not by the Charter. By a 19-year-old boy in a refectory, because that is how empires actually decide things, Teodor. They decide them in refectories." She put 2 fingers on her desk. "You have 60 demerits and 2 citations in 26 hours. I know. Your line supervisor has suspended your practicum. That is a formality before removal. There is a review board convening in 11 days. She looked at him. "It will remove you. You understand that I am not threatening you. I have no power over this at all. I am telling you the weather." "Yes, ma'am." "Then tell me why." Teodor Marsh looked at his hands, which were stained from the reactor shop, and thought about how to say it and found that he could not because there was nothing to say. There was no argument. He had gone looking for one for 3 days and there wasn't one. There was only a room and a hole in the room and a girl in the hole. "There's a table," he said, "and she's been sitting at it alone for 3 weeks and nobody's done anything." He looked up. "That's it. That's all I've got." Consul Ade closed her eyes. Do you know, she said, how many species in this empire have a shunning practice? No. 58 of the 61. It is one of the most widely convergent behaviors in known biology. It shows up on worlds that never touched each other, in species that don't share a single base pair, and it always works. She opened her eyes. That's the part nobody tells you. It always works, Teodor. It is a bloodless execution, and it is 100% effective. And it is effective because in 58 species the shunned individual is not the only one who feels it. The shunners feel it. It is physiological. A Vorin who breaks a turning gets tachycardia and vomiting. A Thesic goes into a stress mold. The species that shun are built so that the wall holds itself up, and in 4,000 years of imperial record there is not one documented case, not one, of an outsider crossing a shunning circle. Not one. She leaned back. And then a boy from a wet little planet walks 300 meters and sits down and eats a loaf. Am I in trouble, said Teo, or is this a compliment? It's an autopsy, said Consolide. Get out of my office, and Teodor, she did not look up, eat your dinner. He went to first meal. He was cited. He went to second meal. He was cited. The demerits stopped mattering somewhere around 120, in the way that a number stops being a number when it gets large enough. And after the fourth citation prefect, Sarn Alo stopped saying anything at all, and simply stood at the reclamation slot with his slate and his damp, immaculate face, and ticked, and did not meet anyone's eyes. The other thing started on the fifth day. Teo came back to his cabin, and his kit was in the corridor. Not thrown, not scattered, folded, squared, stacked with a precision that was, in its way, a kind of apology. Hakon Rogue filled the doorway. You cannot stay here, he said. Hakon. Do you know what contact taint is? The Vorin's voice was very low. It is not superstition. Do not look at me like that, human. I am not a child, and I do not believe in ghosts. It is regulation. Article 9. Any being in habitual close association with a cited violator of an accommodation statute may be cited by association at a prefect's discretion. Habitual close association. We share a cabin. We have shared it for 9 months. He stopped. Something in the enormous banded muscle of his throat worked. I am first in the line, Marsh. I am the first Vorin of my house in 4 generations to reach the line. There are 11 of them at home. 11 in one house, and they have all of them worked, and none of them arrived, and I have arrived. And if I am cited by association, I do not arrive. I know, said Teo. Then take your kit. I'm taking it. He crouched and picked it up. It was not heavy. He had never owned much. He stood and he looked up, a long way up, into the small, deep orange eyes of the person who had woken him every morning for 9 months. Hakon, it's all right. It is not all right, said Hakon Rogue. Do not tell me it is all right. It is not all right, and you will not make it all right by being gracious about it. That is the most human thing you have ever done, and I hate it. His hands had closed. Why? Give me a reason. Give me one reason that is not a feeling. I don't have one. Then give me the feeling. Teo stood in the corridor with his kit in his arms. She's been alone for 3 weeks, he said, and I found out I could stop it by picking up a chair. The Vorin stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he stepped back and the door closed, and Teodor Marsh went and slept in the reactor shop, on a pallet between the coolant lines, where it was 90 degrees and never dark, and where he slept for the next 11 nights. He kept going to meals. He was cited 14 more times. And in the 6-meter emptiness at the end of table 41, 3 times a day, 40 minutes at a time, 2 19-year-olds ate protein loaf and talked. It took 4 days for her to say anything that was not a warning. On the 4th day she said, without preamble, halfway through second meal, the keel. What? You keep looking at it. She touched the ridge of bone that rose from the bridge of her nose over her skull. Everyone does. Nobody asks. It is a sinus. It is full of air, and there is a membrane at the back of it, and when a ship goes to hard vacuum and the pressure drops, the membrane resonates and we hear it. It is how our ancestors knew a reef was near, on the water. The sound comes back off the reef and the keel hears it. She turned her loaf over. It is why they use us. We can hear a mass shadow 11 seconds before an instrument sees it, not think it, hear it. It is a sound, human. It is the actual sound of a large thing in the dark. Teo put down his fork. On the long patience, he said, did you hear something? She was quiet for a long time. No, she said, that is the entire tragedy and everyone gets it backwards, including my own people. I did not hear anything. It was not the void that killed them. It was the drive. She flattened her hands on the table, the old posture, the 22-day posture. I was junior astrogator, 3 months in service. The primary coil was reading a phase slip of 0.04 in the second harmonic, and I logged it, and I took it to the drive officer. And the drive officer was a very good officer with 19 years in, and she told me that a 0.04 slip in a Kessin coil is within tolerance. And she was right, human. That is the thing nobody understands. She was right. It is within tolerance. It says so in the manual. But you thought. I thought it was rising, said Ashevin. I had 4 readings and the interval was shortening. I did not have a theory. I had a feeling in the keel which is not evidence, and I was 3 months in service and she was 19 years in service, and she said thank you, astrogator, which is a thing an officer says when a subject is closed. She looked at him with her enormous dry black eyes, and I said, yes, sir. And I went back to my station, and I did not raise it again because it would have been rude. The refectory breathed around them. 11 people, she said, are dead because I was polite. Teo did not say it's not your fault, because he had a face like a window and no talent for lying, and because he understood with a clarity that frightened him, that she would have gotten up and left the table. How long, he said instead, between the last reading and the cascade? 6 days. So you had 6 days to be rude in. Yes, said Ashevin Dorosol, I had 6 days. He nodded slowly. He picked up his fork. He ate a piece of loaf and chewed it and swallowed. So did they, he said. The other 10. They all knew what a phase slip log looks like. It's in the manual, you said so. Any one of them could have pulled your log. She stared at him. That is not. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. It doesn't make you feel better, I can see it doesn't. He shrugged, a small human motion she had never seen and would remember all her life. I'm saying it because it's true and nobody said it to you. That's all. Somebody should say the true thing at least once. She sat very still. You are, she said at last, an extremely irritating person. Yeah, said Teo, Hakon says that too. It was on the 9th day, at 3rd meal, in the drowsy blue light that she told him. She had been building up to it for 4 days and he had watched her do it, and he had let her, because he had learned by then that she was a person who arrived at things the way a ship arrives at a jump point, on a plotted course, and could not be hurried. I have to tell you something, she said, and when I have told you, you will not sit here again, and that will be correct, and I want you to know now, before I say it, that I will not think less of you. Okay. There is a determination of factual obsolescence, she said, and I have written it. He listened. She laid it out, all of it, in the flat, exact voice of a navigator giving a course, the register that freezes and does not track, the Assembly's reform, 189 years dead, the ethnographer's marginal note, the office that will not read a determination unless an arbiter hands it over, the arbiter who cannot make a finding except in a live matter, the live matter that requires a prosecution, the prosecution that requires a violation, the violation that requires a person. There has never been a violation, she said. Not in 400 years. The wall is perfect, human, that is what nobody outside understands. The wall is not guarded. It has never needed to be guarded. It has held for 400 years on courtesy alone. Her hands were flat on the table, and her voice did not change at all, and something was running down her face, and she did not touch it. And I sat down at that table on the first day knowing all of it, knowing exactly what I needed, knowing that the only thing in the universe that could save me was a person willing to be destroyed, and I could not ask, because if I ask, it is void. So I sat where I could be seen, every meal, for 22 days. I made myself into a question, and I put it in the middle of the largest room in the quadrant, and I waited for someone to answer it. She looked at him. "And you did," she said, "and you did not know you were doing it. And now I am sitting here across from a 19-year-old boy who has lost his cabin and his line and his species one seat, who sleeps on a floor next to a coolant line, and I am about to ask him to let me take his ruin and put it in front of an arbiter and use it, because it is the only key that will ever exist, and there will never be another one, because there is no one else in 11,000 worlds who would do what you did." Her voice finally broke. One small fracture, quickly closed. "I did not ask you to sit down. I want that on record between us. But I am asking you this, and I will understand entirely if you get up." Teodor Marsh looked at her for a while. Then he said, "Is it a good filing?" She blinked. "Is it a good filing?" he repeated. "The determination, is it any good? Because if I'm going to get thrown out of the fleet line for a piece of paper, I'd like the paper to be excellent." "It is," said HFY Dorosol, "the finest thing I have ever made." "Then use it," said Teo, and picked up his fork. She sat there. The blue light of third meal came down through the vault, and 11,000 beings ate and talked and pretended not to watch, and somewhere in the middle of the largest room in the Fourth Imperial Quadrant, a Sorrai woman who had not been touched by another living creature in 2 years put both her hands over her face and shook, silently, for a long time, while a human boy ate his dinner across from her and did not say anything at all, because he had worked out, somehow, at 19, that there was nothing to say, and that leaving would be worse. It was the 10th day, in the corridor outside the refectory, that 4 Vorin took him. They did it without heat, which was the horror of it. They put him against the bulkhead, and one of them, a big second year with a scar through his lip, spoke very close to his face and said that the wall had held for 400 years, and that walls that hold are not walls, they are floors, and that everyone in this station was standing on this one. And did the human understand what happens to everyone standing on a floor when someone takes an axe to it? Then they hit him, twice in the body, with the flat professional economy of people who intend a message and not an injury. He went to third meal. He was late, and he came in through the north door holding his ribs, and one eye was closing, and the refectory saw him, all of it, 11,000 beings at once, and the noise did the thing it did, that spreading ring of silence, and he walked 300 meters through it slowly, because it hurt, and he sat down at the end of table 41. HFY stood up so fast the bench shrieked. "Sit down," said Teo. "It's fine, it's nothing. Sit down, they're looking at you." "Who?" she said. "Doesn't matter." "Who?" "Ashy." It came out of him without permission, the shortened thing, the human thing, the syllable nobody in the universe had ever used, and she stopped as though she had been struck. "Sit down, please, it's dinner." She sat down. And 11 meters away, at the near end of table 41 in the empty ring, a very small being with gray fur and 6 fingers put down a bowl. His name was Ordo, and he was a chow, and he weighed as much as a coat. The chow were the smallest sapients in the empire, gray-furred and 6-fingered and archival by temperament, and they had joined the concordance 800 years ago by simply agreeing to everything, immediately, without negotiation, which was the only recorded instance of it. They ran the record vaults. They were universally liked and universally overlooked, which is a specific kind of loneliness that Ordo of the Chow had been living in for the entirety of his 3 years at Kelverath, and which is perhaps why he had spent 23 days looking at the end of table 41. He put down his bowl 11 meters away, at the very edge of the empty ring, and he sat, and he ate, and he did not look at them, and his small gray hands were shaking so hard that his spoon rang against the rim of the bowl like a bell. He was cited 30 demerits. He came back at first meal and sat 10 meters away. Prefect Sarn Alo cited him again, and Ordo of the Chow, who had never in his life said a word louder than necessary, said, in a voice like a hinge, "It is a large room, Prefect. 10 meters is not consorting. Where is the line?" And Sarn Alo stood there with his stylus and had no answer because there was none. The statute said consort with, dine with, address, or offer comfort to. It did not say 6 meters. It had never needed to say 6 meters. Nobody had ever asked. The wall had been holding itself up for 400 years, and now a creature the size of a coat was standing at the bottom of it with a spoon, asking where exactly it was. The prefect cited him anyway, but he had hesitated, and 11,000 beings had seen him hesitate, and after that the whole thing came apart faster than anyone could have believed. Baloo came next. She came out of the kitchens at second meal on the 12th day, 4 arms and a folded blanket face in her apron, carrying nothing at all, and she walked the length of the refectory in the white light, and she sat down at the end of table 41 directly beside Ashaven Dorosal, close enough that their sleeves touched, and she said loudly, in a voice that carried 30 meters, "Ashaven Dorosal, you have not been eating the extra portion, and I have noticed, and I am insulted." The room heard it. The room heard her name said out loud by an employee of the anchorage in the middle of second meal, and something went through 11,000 beings like a current through wire. Baloo of the Mott could not be cited. She was not a cadet. She was staff, on a 140-year contract, with a union of 1, and the prefecture spent 4 hours that afternoon discovering that the disciplinary code of Anchorage Kelvereth had no mechanism whatsoever for punishing a Mott who had decided to be rude. They fired her. They had to, in the end. That was the only lever, and they used it, and she cleaned out her locker on the 13th day and stood in the refectory doorway with her box and looked at the end of table 41 and shrugged all 4 shoulders and said to nobody, "I am 211. What were they going to do, promote me?" She was in the visitors' gallery every meal after that, sitting in the front row in her apron, watching. They could not stop her. She had a right of presence as a discharged employee pending appeal, and she filed the appeal, and then she withdrew it, and then she filed it again, and Ordo of the Chow, who worked in the record vaults, taught her how to file it in a way that took 11 days to process. They came in ones. That was what the record would eventually show, and what the Imperial Bureau of Xenopsychology would spend 40 years failing to explain. They did not come in a wave. There was no moment of mass conversion, no speech, no rising music. They came one at a time over 8 days, each one alone, each one crossing the 6 meters by themselves, each one with a face like a person walking into surf. A Thesic second year named Velashan, who went into a stress molt for 6 days afterward, lost her outer plates, was hospitalized, and came back to the table with her new skin still soft and pink and agonizing under her tunic, and sat down again. 4 Gelt from the pressure lab who came separately over 3 days and never once explained themselves, and one of whom was Ossic, who sat down across from Teo and said, "There is nothing at the end of 41, and then, I have been saying that for 3 weeks, and then put his head in his hands." A Vorin cadet, a first year, who crossed the empty ring at second meal on the 15th day and got exactly halfway and vomited, comprehensively onto the polished floor, in front of 11,000 people, and stood up, gray and streaming, and kept walking and sat down and put his hands on the table and shook. That was the day the refectory changed. Because a Vorin being sick with the turning was not a thing a Vorin could fake, and it was not a thing anyone in the room could pretend they had not seen, and it made visible, in the most humiliating way possible, exactly what crossing that 6 meters cost a being whose body had been built by 4 million years of evolution to make the crossing impossible. and 100 cadets sat there and watched him do it anyway, and understood all at once that they had been telling themselves the wall was made of biology, and it was not. The wall was made of biology in 58 species, and it was made of nothing at all in one, and what the human had proven by walking 300 meters with a tray on the 23rd day was that the wall could be crossed by anyone who was willing to be sick on the floor in front of everyone. They had not been unable. They had been unwilling. Those are different words, and the Empire had spent 4,000 years arranging never to have to learn the difference. By the 17th day, there were 40 of them at the end of table 41. By the 19th there were 200, and they had run out of bench, and cadets were sitting on the floor around it, in a spiral with their trays on their knees, in exactly the place where 3 weeks earlier they had sat on the floor along the eastern wall to avoid it. Nobody spoke much. That was the thing that struck the visiting observers later when the records were reviewed. There was no chanting. There were no signs. It was the least demonstrative demonstration in the history of the Concordant Empire. 200 young beings ate protein loaf in the vicinity of a Sorrai woman quietly and went to class. The prefecture issued 940 citations in 6 days and then stopped, because Ordo of the Chow, working from the record vaults with the assistance of a discharged Mott cook, filed a procedural challenge noting that the prefecture's citation authority under Article 9 required individual assessment of habitual close association, and that individual assessment of 940 cadets would require, by the prefecture's own published standards, 4,100 hours of hearings. The citations stood against the first 16. Teodor Marsh's stood at 390 demerits and 22 counts. And in the middle of it all, at the end of the table in the eye of it, sat HFY Dorosal, who had not been spoken to in 2 years and was now being spoken to by 200 people, and who was, quietly, coming apart. "I cannot," she said to Teo on the 18th day in the corridor with her hands in her sleeves. "I cannot look at them. Do you understand? For 22 days I built a wall inside myself that could survive being nothing to anyone. It is the only structure I have, and they are taking it down brick by brick with bowls of soup, and I am going to be standing there with nothing." "Yeah," said Teo. "That is not comfort." "No," he agreed, "it's just true." She looked at him with her enormous black eyes. "You are the worst friend I have ever had," she said, "and I have had one." The man at table 39 had been there the whole time. Teo noticed him on the 19th day, and once he noticed, he could not understand how he had missed it. A Sorrai, old, in the deep blue of the Assembly Liaison Service, sitting alone at the near end of table 39 with a tray in front of him. Alone, because the Sorrai delegation on Kelverath numbered 9, and the other 8 sat at the far end. Alone with a tray, and the tray was untouched. Teo went and stood in front of him. "You've been sitting here every meal," he said, "for 4 weeks. The old Sorrai did not look up. 69 days, he said. 69. She has been in the refectory for 40. I have been here since the day she was returned to service. He lifted his head. His face was the wreck of hers, 30 years further along, and the keel over his skull was cracked and mended and cracked again. I am Dorokesh. I am the brother of her mother. I have sat where I could see her, 3 times a day, for 69 days, and I have not eaten a mouthful in this room in all that time, because to eat while she does not eat is a thing I am not able to do." Teo's throat closed. "You could have sat with her." Dorokesh's black eyes were terrible. "Yes. And the witnessing would have been void, human, because a witnessing by kin is not a witnessing. It is a family closing ranks around its own shame, and the Assembly ruled it void 900 years ago, and the Register copied the ruling down like everything else. And I would have been cited, and she would have watched me be cited, and it would have bought her nothing. Nothing at all." His hands were flat on the table in the exact posture of his sister's daughter, and Teo understood, suddenly and completely, where she had learned it. So I have sat here, where she can see me, so that she would know 3 times a day for 69 days that there was one person in this room who had not looked away. Does she know? I do not know, said Dorokesh. I have never been able to ask. Teo sat down across from him. The old Sorrai went very still. I'm not kin, said Teo. I'm nobody. I'm a 19-year-old human with 390 demerits and no cabin. Nobody's going to void anything because of me. He pushed the untouched tray across the table. Eat your dinner, sir. She can see you. Dorokesh of the Sorrai Assembly Liaison Service looked down at the tray for a long moment. Then he picked up the loaf, and he ate it in front of 11,000 people, weeping without a sound, and 40 meters away at the end of table, 41 his sister's daughter watched him do it and put both hands over her mouth. The board convened on the 23rd day. That was the part that told them everything in the end, about what they were actually fighting. The prefecture had the discretion to schedule a disciplinary review at any point within 30 days of citation. Teo's first citation had been on the 23rd day of her window. They scheduled the board for day 41. Ordo of the Chow found it. He came to the reactor shop at the second watch in his sleeping wrap, carrying a slate in both hands like it was full of water, and his fur was standing straight up. Day 41, he said. Cadet Marsh, your board is scheduled for day 41 of her window. Teo sat up on the pallet between the coolant lines. Her window closes on day 40, he said. Yes. So on the day of my board. She is unnamed, said Ordo. She is not residual, she is unnamed, which is a different legal status, and I have read the code 11 times tonight. An unnamed has no standing. She cannot testify. She cannot file. She cannot be cited as an injured party. She cannot be present in a hearing chamber because presence requires standing, and she has none, and she will be aboard a transport to the Sorrai homeworlds within 6 hours of the window closing because discharge is automatic. His 6 small fingers were shaking on the slate. The determination of factual obsolescence she has written is 140 pages long, and it is the best legal document I have ever read, and I work in the record vaults. And on day 41 it will be a document written by nobody. It will not exist. It cannot be entered. It cannot be read into a record by an arbiter, because an arbiter may not receive a filing from a being without standing. Then we move the board. You cannot move a board. Then she files it before day 40. To whom? Ordo's voice cracked. There is no live matter until the board convenes. The arbiter has no jurisdiction to receive anything until he is seated, and he is seated on day 41, and on day 41 she is nobody. He sat down abruptly on a coolant pipe which was too hot and did not seem to notice. It is perfect, cadet. Do you understand? It is not a conspiracy. Nobody did this on purpose. I have checked. The scheduling was automatic. A clerk system took the citation date and added 18 days because 18 days is the median processing interval for a fleet line cadet. It is a number in a machine. The reactor shop hummed. Somewhere behind them a coolant valve opened and closed. That's how it always is, said Teo slowly. Isn't it? Nobody did it. Nobody ever does it. It just happens and everyone's very sorry. He got up off the pallet. Ordo, he said, in the code, when I'm the accused, what rights have I got? The Chow blinked. You have the right to hear the citation, the right to make a statement, the right to, he stopped. He stopped, and his fur went flat, and his enormous dark eyes came slowly up, and he looked at Teodor Marsh with an expression that a Chow had perhaps not worn in 800 years of agreeing to everything immediately without negotiation. You have the right to an advocate, he whispered. Naval Disciplinary Code, Article 40, Subsection 1. The accused shall name one advocate to speak in his defense. He was fumbling at the slate. And the Naval Code is older than the Register, cadet. It is 900 years older, and Article 40, Subsection 2 says, it says. He found it. He read it aloud. in the hot dark of the reactor shop, in his voice like a hinge. The accused may name any being, of any station, condition, rank, or standing, and no bar, disqualification, restriction, or accommodation shall prevent the named advocate from speaking, the right of the accused to his defense being paramount and admitting of no exception whatsoever. Silence. Any being, said Teodor Marsh. Of any condition, said Ordo of the Chow, or standing. They looked at each other. How long, said Teo, would it take you to check that no one's repealed it? Ordo was already standing. Ordo of the Chow, who weighed as much as a coat, who had joined the concordance by agreeing to everything, was already moving toward the door of the reactor shop with his slate clutched to his chest and his fur on end. 11 hours, he said, do not sleep. Her window closed at the fourth bell on day 40. There was no ceremony. That was the thing about the Empire, and Teodor Marsh understood it fully for the first time that morning. It did not gloat, it did not announce, it did not even notice. A field in a record changed from one value to another. A transport berth was allocated. A discharge packet compiled itself in a queue and waited. At the fourth bell, Ashevin Dorosal stopped being anyone. She was in the refectory when it happened, at the end of table 41, with 211 beings sitting around her eating protein loaf, and she did not feel anything change because nothing changed. The loaf was still bad. Ordo was still spilling his soup. Baloo was still shouting instructions from the gallery about the correct way to hold a spoon. Dorokesh was eating his dinner at table 39, which he had done for 17 days. She simply looked up at the fourth bell and met the eyes of a human boy with a healing face and said, "It is done." "Yeah," said Teo. "They will come for me in 6 hours." "Yeah." "Eat your dinner," she said. The board convened the next morning in the Hall of Determinations, and half of Anchorage, Kelverath, tried to get in. They had scheduled it for a chamber that seated 40. They had to move it twice, and in the end they held it in Lecture Vault 9, which seated 2,000, and it was full 90 minutes before the bell, and the corridors outside were full, and the refectory, where they had put up a relay screen, was full. Arbiter Vane Alastri was an Ivres, and he was 410 years old, and he had adjudicated 19,000 matters, and he had never once been reversed. He was not a villain. Teo, standing at the accused's rail in a clean tunic with 390 demerits on his file, looked up at that long, pale, expressionless face and understood that this was the whole problem. Nobody in this story was a villain. Vane Alastri had never hated anyone. He was a man who read what was written and said what it meant, and he had done it perfectly for 4 centuries, and the Empire ran on him, and he had never in his life had a reason to ask whether the things written down were true. "Cadet Teodor Marsh," he said, 22 counts of violation of accommodation statute 11004. You have heard the citations. Do you contest them? "No, sir," said Teo. "I did all of it." A sound went through 2,000 beings. "You do not contest," said the arbiter. "You understand that this is a plea of guilt and that the schedule of penalty is not discretionary." "Yes, sir." "Then this board exists only to determine penalty." The arbiter's stylus moved. "Do you wish to make a statement in mitigation?" "No, sir," said Teodor Marsh. "I want to name my advocate." The stylus stopped. "You have no advocate of record." "Naval Disciplinary Code, Article 40, subsection 1, said Teo. He had memorized it in the reactor shop at the third watch with Ordo whispering it to him line by line. "The accused shall name one advocate to speak in his defense." Subsection 2. "The accused may name any being, of any station, condition, rank, or standing, and no bar, disqualification, restriction, or accommodation shall prevent the named advocate from speaking, the right of the accused to his defense being paramount and admitting of no exception whatsoever." Vane Alastri did not move. "That is the code," he said. Yes, sir. It's 900 years older than the register. Nobody's repealed it. Nobody's ever needed to. Teo's hands were shaking on the rail and he let them. I name HFY Dorosal as my advocate. The Hall of Determinations came apart. It took 4 minutes to restore it. When it was quiet, the prefect of discipline was on his feet, and Sarn Alo, damp and immaculate and 2 years from a garden world, said the thing he had been put there to say, in a voice that did not sound as though he believed a word of it. Arbiter, the named being has no standing. She was unnamed at the fourth bell yesterday. She cannot file, testify, or be present. This is not a bar of custom, it is a bar of status. She is, in the meaning of the code, nobody. Yes, said Arbiter Vain Alestri. And then the 410-year-old Ivres sat in silence for 140 seconds, in front of 2,000 beings, and read Article 40, subsection 2, on his slate. Twice. No bar, he said at last. Disqualification, restriction, or accommodation. Arbiter. Prefect, be seated. The pale face did not change. The code does not say no bar of custom. It says no bar. It says admitting of no exception whatsoever. I have read the article 19 times in 400 years, and I have never once had cause to consider what it meant, because in 400 years no accused has ever named a being without standing, because in 400 years there has never been a being without standing in a room where an accused could see her. He set down the slate. The words are plain. I did not write them. I am not permitted to improve them. He raised his head, and he spoke to the whole vault. Bring her in. They brought her in. She came up the center aisle of Lecture Vault 9 in a cadet's undertunic with the shoulder flashes torn off, 2 hours from a transport berth, carrying a slate with 140 pages on it, and 2,000 beings stood up. They did it without a signal and without a word. The Vorin stood, the Thesic stood, and one of them was still pink and raw under her tunic. Ordo of the Chow stood on his chair, because otherwise no one would have seen him. Belou of the Mott stood in her apron with her 4 arms crossed. Dorokesh of the Sorrai assembly stood with tears running down the cracked keel of his skull. Hakon Rogue, first in the fleet line, stood in the 3rd row with his jaw locked and his eyes fixed straight ahead. HFY Dorosal walked between them and did not weep, because she had a filing to make, and she had been a navigator, and a navigator does not weep on final approach. She reached the advocate's rail. Speak, said the arbiter. And she spoke. She spoke for 2 hours and 11 minutes, and she never raised her voice, and she did not speak about Teodor Marsh at all. She spoke about a survey ethnographer named Ivro Sanhel who had walked the coastal houses of the Sorrai homeworld 406 years ago, and who had written in his own field notes, in the margin in his own hand, that the right of HFY was already in decline among the coastal houses, and much disputed by the young. She put the page on the vault display. 2,000 beings read a dead man's handwriting. She spoke about the Sorrai Assembly's reform of the 19th Convocation, 189 years ago, which had abolished the right of witnessing in its entirety, on the ground that it was cruel, and which had been filed with the Empire, and acknowledged, and stamped, and placed in a vault, and had changed nothing whatsoever, because the register of accommodated practice had no procedure for receiving news. She spoke about her mother, who had never sat HFY in her life, and who did not know the shape of it, and who was at that moment waiting on a dock on a world 400 light-years away to receive a daughter she would not be permitted to name. She spoke about the register itself, 411,000 entries. A machine built to preserve, which had preserved with perfect fidelity, and had therefore become the largest engine of dead custom in the history of the galaxy. A place where practices that living peoples had outgrown, repented of, and abolished went on being enforced forever by an empire that had frozen them out of respect. You did not do this to be cruel, she said. That is what I have come to understand, sitting at the end of a table for 40 days. You did it to be kind. You wrote us down so carefully, and you never once came back to ask if we had changed. And at the very end, in the last 3 minutes, she spoke about the wall. The statute has held for 400 years, she said, and it has never been guarded, and it has never been enforced, and it has never needed to be, because it was held up by a single thing, and the prefecture has no name for that thing, and neither do I, and neither does any species in this empire, though I have looked. It was held up by the fact that crossing it would have been awkward. 11,000 beings walked past me 3 times a day for 40 days, and not one of them hated me, and not one of them thought it was right, and not one of them sat down, and the reason is not evil. The reason is that it would have made a scene. She looked once at the accused's rail. And then a 19-year-old human being carried his dinner 300 meters through a silent room and made a scene. Arbiter Vane Alastri delivered his determination the following morning, and it took him 11 minutes, and he did not soften a single word of it. Teodor Marsh was found guilty on 22 counts. The penalty schedule was not discretionary. 440 demerits stood. His practicum remained void. He was removed from the Fleet Line intake permanently without appeal and reassigned to auxiliary tender maintenance at the rank of Technician Third, which is the lowest rank aboard an Imperial station that comes with a bunk. He stood at the rail and took it, and 2,000 beings watched him take it, and nothing was refunded. And then the arbiter turned to the second matter. This board has received, he said, a determination of factual obsolescence prepared by the named advocate, entered into the record of a live matter, which is the only door through which such a determination may enter, and which has stood closed for 400 years for want of a violation. He set his stylus down. The board finds Accommodation Statute 11004 to be predicated upon a custom which no longer exists, and which has not existed in any living Sorrai community for 189 years. The statute is struck. The right of HFY is expunged from the register. The status of residual and the status of unnamed are void from this hour in all territories of the Concordant Empire. He looked down at the advocate's rail. Astrogator Dorosal, he said, you are restored to rank, name, and service. The record of this board will bear your name and not his, because the argument was yours and the archive should be accurate. He paused, 410 years old, 19,000 matters, never once reversed. The board further directs, he said, a review of the register of accommodated practice in its entirety, upon the ground that this body has today discovered that it has never, in 400 years, verified that any custom it enforces still exists. They called it Dorosal in the record, and the review ran for 19 years. It found 11,400 dead customs and struck 9,000 of them, and across the empire, on worlds that had never heard of Anchorage Kelverath, people who had been sitting alone for a very long time were told, without explanation, that they could go home. The xenopsychologists wrote about the human for a generation and never got it right because they kept looking for the courage in it, and there wasn't any. There was a boy and a tray and a chair. What they finally wrote in the Bureau's 4th revision was this: that 58 of 61 species shun, and that in all of them the wall holds itself up, and that in one species it does not, because that species alone appears to have no reliable instinct for leaving a person alone. The Bureau proposed a new procedural category for the archive, since none had ever been needed. They called it presence, voluntary, unrequired. In 11,000 years of imperial law, there had never been a word for sitting down. 14 months later, Technician Third Teodor Marsh was eating second meal in the refectory of Anchorage Kelverath with grease under his fingernails, and a hull seal manual open beside his tray, at table 41 at the end, under a light well that somebody had finally fixed. He ate there out of habit. The bench was usually crowded now. It was, for reasons nobody could quite reconstruct, the most popular table in the room. The bench shrieked on its pivot. He looked up. She was in the black and silver of a full astrogator of the Imperial Survey, and there was a ship waiting for her at the high dock, and she had come 400 light-years for a meal she did not need, and she sat down across from him and put her hands flat on the table on either side of her tray. "You are eating the green stuff," said Ashaven Dorosal. "It is worse." "It's all worse," said Teo. "You were first in the fleet line in the year you were removed from it. Hakon Rogue told me. He is a commander now. He weeps when he says your name. It is extremely embarrassing." She picked up her loaf. "Do you regret it?" Teodor Marsh looked at her across the table for a while. "No," he said. Around them, the largest room in the Fourth Imperial Quadrant went on being loud. 11,000 beings ate and argued and dropped things. Nobody watched them. Nobody had gone quiet. No ring of silence spread outward across the polished floor, and no channel opened, and not one being in that vast vaulted hall so much as turned a head. He had seen her sitting alone for 3 weeks, and he had done the one thing that no one in 400 years had been willing to do. He had carried his dinner across a silent room, and pulled out a chair and sat. And now there was nothing at all remarkable about 2 people having lunch.